Okay, so let's go through some of your faith journey because obviously that's shaping how you're seeing the world in terms of your fiction writing, and you have a pretty interesting faith journey. Obviously, you and I ended up in very separate places, but you started off. You're born into a Jewish family. I've said to you before, we've had this conversation, but you were born into an extraordinarily secular Jewish family.
Right.
So and now obviously you're a religious Christian. So how do you get from point A to point B?
So the ex-Jew in question here is author and screenwriter Andrew Klaven, and he's about to present a pretty intriguing testimony of how he came to the Christian faith. And then he's going to present to Ben Shapiro the compelling argument that finally won him over to believing in God. I'm going to save my thoughts for the back end. We're going to get right into this clip. Let's get into it.
The weird thing about my family was that it was secular, but it was also committed to, my father at least was committed to the traditions. So we went to Hebrew school, we were bar mitzvahed, we learned this stuff. But it did occur to me that I've always had this, I won't call it an obsession, that's a little too much, but I've always had this idea that things should make sense. If things don't make sense, you should change your mind. And part of that was because of a kind of dysfunctional atmosphere in my house where we were taught a lot of philosophical ideas that were just untrue. And it's very damaging, because you don't want to tear away from your family, but at the same time you want to find the truth. And so I became kind of obsessed with finding the truth. So you're there praying, and you're there learning Hebrew, which is not my language, and you're there wearing, the hat and the thing, and you're thinking, well, if there's no God, and my mother was a stone atheist, and my father was just kind of like, he didn't want to get in trouble with God, but like he didn't exactly believe in him either. And after a while, you start to think, well, this is ridiculous. This is ridiculous. So after my bar mitzvah, that was kind of the turning point. I was bar mitzvahed. I got thousands of dollars worth of gifts that I put in this box. And one day I got up and threw the box away because with everything in it. And I just thought this
like
is
the old lady at the end of Titanic.
Yeah, this is exactly. This is ill-gotten gains. This is not what I wanted. And I expected to live my life as a sort of intellectual agnostic, like the way, I think this kind of was the default position of thinking men in my day, and it's kind of still is.
Still now, exactly. Yeah, I'm doing this routine now, yeah.
Right, and I think that was going to be it. That was really my position, which is very flattering to the intellectual mind because you can analyze everything into dust. You can just, no matter how small the point is, you can break it up into even smaller pieces. Because you don't have that bottom line of there has to be meaning, there has to be morality, The problem was, when I was 19, I read Crime and Punishment, and it convinced me that the moral world existed. It convinced me that Kant was right. There was the starry sky above and the moral law within, and that was undeniably true. And because of that, I kept circling around, well, where does this morality and meaning come from? And I wasn't satisfied with things I hear from guys like our pal Jordan Peterson, the Italian philosopher Marcello Pera, says, live as if there were a God. And I think to live as if there were a God is essentially to want the conclusions of a syllogism whose premises you don't accept.
Right.
And
that's right.
It just makes no sense. And so, again, everything had to make sense to me. And ultimately, I had, when I was a kid, I've lived like these two lives. I had terrible emotional problems because I had a terrible relationship with my father. My household was dysfunctional in this very invisible way. There was not a lot of violence. There was not a lot of hatred. It was just this kind of invisible dysfunction. And so I cracked up. There came a point when I was like 28 years old. I just stopped working, basically. I just went, boom, something's wrong. And at that point, which would have been the smart point to seize hold of God like a piece of driftwood floating by in the ocean, I thought then I'll never believe because it'll always be this thing I did because I was weak, because I was down on my luck, because I was broken. It'll always be this crutch that I seized hold of. It just shows you how stubborn I was about things making sense, And so instead, by the grace of God, I found a shrink who cured me. And I always laugh about this. I'm the only person I've ever known who was cured by psychiatry. But he did, within the course of like 2-3 years of talking to this guy, I was a completely different human being. And it was only then when I felt sane, when I felt certain that my impressions were correct, when I felt certain that I was not living a delusional life, that it seemed obvious to me that there was a God because of my moral stance. And the stance that if everybody on earth, there was a time when everybody on earth believed that slavery was right. Even the slaves, they would have said, yeah, I don't want to be the slave, but this is the way things are. At that time, slavery was wrong. And once you say that, you're screwed God-wise. You cannot get away from the idea that somewhere there is this moral base, this base of meaning. And this is the thing that's become fascinating to me now, because there are guys like you and me who actually believe, but we're kind of anomalies in the world of the thinking man. I think there is right now, the world of the thinking man is divided into two. On one side, you have people like Jordan Peterson, Douglas Perry, who wrote that book, The Strange Death of Europe, and Houellebecq, the novelist we were talking about, Houellebecq, who are basically saying the West can't survive without the Judeo-Christian thesis. We should all ascribe to the Judeo-Christian thesis. I myself do not believe.
Right.
They're all saying the same thing. I myself cannot believe. On the other side, you have these guys like Yuval Harari and who wrote *Sapiens*, and Steven Pinker, who are saying, no, my friend. We are going up and up and up. This has been an absolute.
Well, give it to Harari. I think that Harari is at least more intellectually honest than Pinker. I mean, I think that Pinker does this whole routine where the Enlightenment will save us and everything is going to continuously get better, and you can carve away the foundations of Western civilization, nothing will crumble. And Harari is basically like, well, maybe civilization sucked in the first place, right? Maybe if we just go back to living in fields and we were happier when we were eating grass and all this kind of stuff. And at least he's honest that way.
And he has this kind of Vulcan idea that we're all living in a delusion. Like the problem with him is he says the most unique, his phrase, I would never say the most unique, but he does. He says the most unique thing about *Sapiens* is the fictions we create. So we have a fiction that there's a God. We have a fiction that we have human rights. We have a fiction of money. Money has no value. But that's not how fiction works. I mean, fiction describes something. It does not create things. I can create a delusional world through fiction, but good fiction it describes reality. So money is a good example. Money describes the value of something to a human being when he has a lot of it or when he doesn't have a lot of it. That's what it describes. It actually does have a value that we're accepting. The paper doesn't, but the idea does.
I wish he would have touched a little bit more on why he specifically went down the Christianity route instead of the Judaism route. And I tried to look up online why that was exactly the case for him, but I couldn't really find anything. So that was a little disappointing to see, but hey, whatever. Regardless, the argument that Andrew Klavan laid out for God is, in my opinion, one of the most compelling ones to me, and that's the moral case for God. And it basically goes like, we all have a set of moral code. We might vary on the code and disagree on what principles are more valuable. You might value fairness more than I value justice or compassion or something like that. But we all have this moral code. And any time that we fight and argue over what the moral code should be, we're appealing to a higher authority that is above us, a higher standard. And that higher standard begs for there to be a moral lawgiver. And the argument goes that it's God. God is the moral lawgiver. And we can observe this throughout the world. Even if we go to the most remote tribe, they're going to have some sort of moral system there. And everybody recognizes this innate sense of fairness and justice. Even if they classify it to varying degrees, we all have it. There's that something higher up there. And there's something that doesn't sit right with me with the example that Andrew Klavan gave. And I agree with him that if we go back 300 years ago to when slavery was all over the West, it was held that, it just kind of was there. It was what it was. And I think that you probably agree with me that slavery is just absolutely wrong. It's wrong now, and it was also wrong then. And for me to concede that there is no God, there is no longer a moral authority to appeal to that slavery being wrong, because ultimately it is just their personal taste versus mine. Slavery, it's not necessarily wrong or right. It's just a different belief. It's a different opinion. But this is just one argument for God. It's not airtight. There's holes in this. But also, me coming to Christ myself, it was not from any of these arguments or trying to outprove God or find the best argument for it. It was actually more of a much more intimate and emotional and personal thing. You see, I was living a way that I didn't feel was right. I felt that I was kind of ugly inside. My life on the surface, I was doing what most kids my age are doing in college. I was playing around with some substances and getting into trouble and doing promiscuous things, which is pretty normal for my age, but internally inside my head, just some thoughts that I would have about other people and the way I'd go about manipulating situations, I thought was just kind of gross. And so I felt this bad inside of me, and I was like, all right, I gotta fix this. So what I did is I got into a lot of these self-help books behind me. You can't see most of them. They're along like this side of the wall. But I got into these self-help books, and for a year, I put everything, all of the effort I possibly could into just trying to be the best person that I could possibly be and fix myself. And if you looked at my life externally, you would think that I did. I started going to the gym every day. I let go of a lot of the substances that held a heavy hold on my life. I stopped with the promiscuous stuff and found a nice girl and settled down with her a little bit. And so many other things that just, it made it look like my life was made and the compassion I had for other people. But the thing is, internally, it didn't fix what was wrong with me. I still had this ugliness inside of me that I just couldn't shake. And it left me with this lingering kind of guilt about it. And I realized that I literally just put everything in I had to try and get rid of that, but I couldn't fix it, and I didn't know it was wrong. And so the last option I feel like I had, I was desperate. I called out to God, not knowing if he was even real, and well, he answered me, and he was like, yeah, Jaden, I mean, you got this bad inside of you, and you can't fix it on your own, and only he can fix it. And he cured me of a lot of the things I was facing, of my depression, of my anxieties, of my insecurities. And he gave me a new heart and just gave me this great amount of peace and joy that I've never quite experienced before. And like, I still have this ugliness inside of me, but it's just been kind of clothed with this, it's hard to explain, this like love of God. And just him being there to pick me up when I'm down and help me walk in the way that is right, in the way that is true. And I want you to be able to experience that too. And I want Ben Shapiro to experience that as well. And so I hope that one day you may come to Christ. You might never, you might have already have, but regardless, I hope you have a great day. And if you want to learn more about the case for God, I recommend checking out the video on screen right about there. Have a great day. Bye-bye.